There we go. Thank you so much. All right. Well, after that segue, yeah, really a pleasure to be here today. And this is sort of, John Patterson Williams with the University of Alberta. And I think I know many of you here. And as I was thinking, I saw there's 59 people on this call. And a few weeks ago, I was in Peace River and doing some wetland and peatland work. And I went out to the brewery in Peace River, and what they did, I unintentionally stumbled into a speed friending night. I didn't want to meet new people. I was feeling rather introverted. But I sat in the corner wanting to prepare my presentation, and they said, "Oh, are you here for the speed friending?" And so, you could 1 minute you have with a person, and then you switch. And I was thinking that actually today, there's such wisdom and insight in this group. And I know I appreciated very much being in person at the AGM last year and meeting some of you in person. So there is some familiarity. But maybe next time, Irina, we do some speed friending, because then you can hear in 1 minute what we've done around a group. So anyway, that's not for the introverts, but it helps some of us. Can you advance, please, Diego? So I just want to acknowledge, too, that I'm working in Treaty 6 territory, which has provided a traveling route and home for the Musqueam, Nehewak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and other Indigenous peoples. And it's this is a beautiful place. And I know that many of you, even some of the research sites that have been spoken of earlier, have been up here in the Camrose Creek area. And it's a real privilege to live and work here. So can I advance? So I will say that I was nominated to give the talk on behalf of these 2 extension programs, which is, of course, an honor. But what accompanies that is a sense that I'm not perfectly familiar with everyone's work. And I want to acknowledge this fantastic team, both on the prairies, or the LWW, the Lake Winnipeg Watershed, which is Pat Lloyd-Smith, who was on the call from University of Saskatchewan, Irina, myself, and also Liam Bolt I see on here, and Ashley Klotz, some of our graduate students and research assistants. So, and of course, David Aldred. And once you start naming, you sort of miss people. But anyway, it's been a great group in the prairies, as well as the Ontario and Great Lakes team, of which I'm more of a junior. I feel like Roy and G and Lota and Ben and all of you are much more, that's where you live as well. So there's a lot more presence there. So I want to acknowledge that team as well, and all the great graduate students and researchers involved. So I'm providing a synthesis overview, but thankfully everyone's here for the conversations after. Can you advance, please? Like any good presentation, this is what I'm just going to succinctly, I hope, cover in terms of objectives and progress. These 4, and then we will touch on a little bit of that sort of collaborative and future-looking recommendations. So I hope it's logical and makes sense to all of you. And Guillaume, thank you for your introduction. You're thinking critically and evaluating here how things fit in. So I'll touch on each of these objectives just to give you a sense of where we're at, and of course, open up to questions afterwards. I will note that in these 2 projects, the Prairie socioeconomic component has come to a close. We had 3 years, and then the Great Lakes is at a sort of in the midway point. So that adds to sort of as we try to align this together, there's maybe some disconnect, but I think it's still a really great working team, and I think it flows well. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first point and objective here, this is the progress update that we're looking at. And I won't speak too deeply to this. I mean, David Aldred, I thank you so much, and Irina, and I think Michael and all the team, thank you for what you've done on here. But this is evaluating the methods of mapping of wetlands and looking at some of those historical rates over time. And I'm trying to sort of put them next to each other from the Prairie Pothole and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin. And so this is the work that this side of the team, we worked on, to looking at different wetland inventories in the Pothole region and overlaying these maps with lakes and rivers. So going up all the way to, and the work continued to August 2023. Similarly, in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin, you can see that similar trend. And I really like how the flow of the map shows here of the years and give a snapshot of the work that's being done. I would say that for these, just if you have questions, just hold them till the end. And of course, Irina and your team can be more suited to respond. Go on, please. And then when we look at the inventory of wetlands too, similarly, again, David, thank you for this. And we see a little bit of these from those inventories. There was a generated wetland area and numbered density maps at scaled polygons within both regions. So it's really fascinating as we see over time, you can see these density maps. And I think I always, as an economist, I think I always have this mantra sort of as I speak. It's like we need the biophysical information to inform these ecosystem service discussions, which then sort of the economic valuation and policy, it's built upon the good work that these teams do. And I think, as Irina's mentioned earlier, there is a divide, sort of a disciplinary divide that sort of naturally can appear in universities or professionally between that sort of natural science and engineering and then the social science and humanities. And I think although we haven't done it perfectly, I think there has been some bridges built here and some engagement across so that we actually look at this collaboratively. And I think that's how we solve some of these sort of larger issues that we're thinking about, especially in the context of climate change and carbon. So thank you, Guillaume. Diego. Sorry, Guillaume. Guillaume, you could advance my slides too if you want, but there is, so I guess what we're thinking of here, there's this circle, right? We're building upon with this good team of understanding some of the biophysical aspects. But as David Lobb, I think you said early on in the day, you said, quote, like the link to the landowner is key. And I think this is what we're driving into here. We can have fantastic work and fantastic models, but yet if we don't sort of link to those decisions that landowners are making, the people that, we restored these wetlands outside our door here a few years ago with Ducks Unlimited, and all our neighbors, and we're just one little tip of the whole pothole region, or not to mention the Great Lakes. Understanding the decisions that landowners are making is so key. To do that, though, we wanted a baseline understanding, and both groups, both in the Lake Winnipeg watershed and the Great Lakes watershed, one of our first steps was to do a systematic review or understanding of what are the drivers of wetland conversion. So what is the published literature out there, and what are some themes arising from those retained documents that we've kept in our analysis? And I think, I only have 25 minutes left or so here, so I won't go into too much detail, but we have worked on a report on these and hope to have this published in a collaborative way in the coming year. But we're looking at, what are the services being discussed, and what are the drivers of loss, and what about policy, what's happening? And so these sort of themes were drawn out of the published literature in sort of more qualitative sense. That's something I've been working on. And then Roy and much of the team, I'm just using a snapshot here from the Ontario group, Roy Brower and your team, have some mapping looking at farmland value and increases. So together, there's a bit of a quantitative, qualitative approach here that we're hoping, I think, to link well together. And of course, G and Lota, there's work being done in Quebec similarly. And so what's arising out of this, I think, we do recognize that, especially in the prairies, there's a stronger agricultural, crop row agriculture driver of conversion that's occurring. And tempers a little as you move into the Great Lakes watershed and St. Lawrence watershed with some more of that urban expansion as you would expect. But note that these are, really, I think, good baselines, and we'd love to have sort of input from all of you on that. So next slide, please. And then, as any good social scientist, we seek and use surveys. And I think this was probably one of the foundational points of our foundations of our data and the work that we've done. And what's, I think, really wonderful about this is that it was collaborative. So note that between the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence and the Prairie team. So, really big kudos, especially to Pat Lloyd-Smith and your work on this survey, and Lota and Roy and G and the team. We designed a survey together to look at, interprovincial farm survey. This focused on all 5 provinces: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. And it had these 6 component parts: understanding farm level information, understanding context around wetlands on the farm. We had sort of the meat of it was this choice experiment, and thanks to Pat for a lot of your work on that, to actually get a willingness to accept estimates. And, we're shy on that in Canada of good data on this. And so this is a massive contribution that this funding provided, and an opportunity for us all. And then focusing on wetland policies, so understanding of the policies in each province and sort of what people think about them, their knowledge base, and sort of their response to them. And then, of course, sort of some ideas around environmental attitudes, and then the demographics that we're facing, or that we were sampling. So if you advance, Diego. So this is a summary slide of all 5 provinces. We use the firm Kinetic, which is a really, I would say, one of the premier sort of agricultural consulting survey companies in Canada right now. And so we use them to reach out to their panel. And again, it was a panel approach for producers. And as you can see, we had approximately 200 producers in each province that were sampled of completed surveys, which is really quite great, right, to have this many. And I will note that I believe Roy and Jay, you're expanding a little to get a few more responses in Ontario and Quebec, but I can let you go on to that later. But this is a simple summary statistics, thanks to a few of my colleagues for putting this together, especially Ashley Klotz, my master's student. So just wanting to show this is interesting. What we're finding too is that the farm size is quite large, especially in the prairies. So you're seeing that, I think this reflects a few things, this type of the sample, but also just the trend in agriculture. So those decisions will impact, a larger farm, which is the trend these days, and particularly in the prairies, has a different sort of response somewhat to some of the smaller producers. And these are crop producers only, not including beef. Can you advance, please? Thanks. And so particularly around the contingent valuation for the choice experiment, we looked at sort of 4 controls, and this really is a fascinating one. We looked at sort of just a baseline wetland conservation as a control on the bottom. And then we had wetlands and wildlife habitat, so more the biodiversity component. And then we looked at another treatment that was looking at water management. I think anyone that is familiar with Saskatchewan these days know that they don't have a wetland policy, but there's a water management policy just came in, which is a telling word really in many ways. And then the top one is where we focus particularly on carbon and sort of perceptions around that. And so, I'm not going to go in today to all that detail. We're constrained by time, but each of these has really, with the analysis, kind of great value and power to speaking to even some of those, as Irina was speaking, and the work that you and Sherry are doing, some of that sort of layers and what's happening there. There's a lot of interest, I think, that can link together. Yes, next slide, please, Diego. And then just, just a few little, so you're not just seeing text or anything like that, just what we're looking at. This is the distribution of respondents in the prairies, and then this is the Ontario one. I apologize, don't have the Quebec one yet, so I'm not meaning to leave you out, Jay and Lota. But this is just a sense of where we were getting responses by postal code. Next slide, please. And then even some thoughts around who has participated in drainage. I know, Irina, you had a couple slides, so I tried to bring in a little bit more from some of the other provinces here. Who has participated in retention activities or restoration. And, you can see trends there that, even our themes around retention, they make, if you can keep them on the landscape, that not only makes often sort of biophysical sense, but also economic, financial sense, rather than those restoration components. Though I do say it is beautiful to see a wetland be restored and see it so slowly over the years coming back into its full provision of services. And I think there's reasons though. So you see, we're trying to tease into this, understanding the decisions. So reasons for drainage seem to be increasing of farmable acres. Well, you know, that makes sense. I don't think it's too mind-blowing to realize that. But then other things you think about, low yields near wetlands. And that's interesting. That's from Quebec, but we also can dive into that for the prairies in Ontario too. Idea about retention was often it was not worth it, or that actually the drainage wasn't worth it, or that habitat and biodiversity had some component there. And then again, this idea of restoration is the sense of low yields near wetlands or private benefits might be possible. So those things we will all dig into, and but just gives you a bit of a sense of what we have found and are finding. Next slide, please. This is just for those that want to look and think about it. I know nothing about the models all of you have been presenting earlier, but I trust the rigor of it. Just wanted to point this out. This is one of the models that we've been using to understand the willingness to accept payments to participate in programs. So next slide, please. And I really appreciate, this result. Tristan, thank you so much for this. So I just want to highlight the Quebec, the good work that G and Tristan are doing here. And this is some of their models, what they're showing around farm size and what sort of response to drainage, retention, and restoration. Of course, this is something we can dive into more later, but just showing there's a narrative story in all of this that we can explore more deeply. Next slide, please. And again, just showing this slide about drainage. This is specific to the prairies, and this is my master's student, Ashley Klotz. She's just doing a fantastic job, nearing the end of her thesis, not quite done yet, as we all face as we reach those final days of writing a thesis. But she's showing a little bit about, again, the reasons for drainage. Next slide, please. And then again, more detailed into the reasons for retention and restoration. Note that this doesn't have the Quebec and Ontario components here, but just wanted to show that graphically. Next slide, please. And then again, this interesting, she's using a multinomial logit model. So again, thank you to Ashley. This is part of your master's thesis and nearing completion, but I'm really excited to see what comes of this. She's looking at things like the size of the wetland, for the penalties if you actually do drain, the duration of the term for keeping it in as a wetland or for restoration, and then some of the contract size. So all of this, I think, is just, it might not seem, just a graph like this, but there's a lot of power and information in here that really feeds off of what's been provided earlier, the earlier objectives, and I think can really enhance and elevate much of the messaging. Next slide, please. Again, just showing a little bit, again, if we're thinking of carbon, as we naturally are, funded by this pool of funds, looking at that, what is carbon, water, habitat, and then we're also distinguishing between provinces as well. And I'll say that even though we are working as for all 5 provinces, we have not, naturally at this point, Roy and his team are more Ontario, G and Lota and Tristan are Quebec, and then Pat and I and Ashley and Liam are here in the prairies. So next slide, please. This is what I wanted to put, and then preliminary, but this is some interesting stuff here. And again, preliminary, so don't, take this and run with it. But I tried to get the, I got Ashley to bring some of this out. This will be a lot of in her thesis. Few farmers that had retained or restored wetlands were motivated by conservation payments. What the heck? Isn't that interesting? I think that maybe flies in the, so we need to interrogate that further, and we are, but that could be a challenge, right? Something that we're thinking about. There is anecdotal evidence from that, from surveys, but to see this at a larger level is something we want to dig into more. More positively, producers are more likely to participate in wetland retention programs and restoration programs. They are not as sensitive to the size of the wetland area under a contract. fascinating as well. Why is that? And then when we're looking at the annual payment amount, or if it's permitted in a basin, understanding the policy context, if there is, termination costs associated, that significantly influences their willingness to accept compensation. And then naturally, there are differences in the duration of the contract, but they don't significantly differ between 25 and 40 years. Again, something really neat as we think about what about conservation easements and term and perpetual, those sort of hot button issues that come up. So a lot of fascinating information coming out here. And again, this is prairie specific at this point. This does not include Ontario and Quebec. And then interesting, the past investment and drainage activities makes sense. It has a negative influence on their participation in the program. That's I think, if you've invested already in doing a lot of drainage, it's like, oh gosh, we've put in this time and effort and cost for whatever the reason, then it's harder to stimulate future engagement. So that's a fascinating. I just wanted to sort of tease a little bit out there for you and see where we're going. Thanks, Diego. We're anticipating each other now. We're in sync. Then I wanted to note point 3.3, and George, thank you so much for some of the really good work you're doing here. So we had the survey, or sort of a background, we have survey and information coming out of it, and then we're thinking about some of those quantification and mapping of values, ecosystem service values. And really, I'm not the expert on these ones, but George sent me this slide, and I really appreciate it as you're looking at significant efforts are really, and significant benefits are provided by Canada's agricultural wetlands. And interesting, that language about managed and non-managed are really fascinating again in this context. So we'll note this. So thank you, George, and thank you, Diego. Next slide, please. Again, there's some work that your team is doing on, or our team, but I just don't want to claim credit for something that I don't know here. Delineation of the role of wetlands in nutrient export and eutrophication programs. So of course, when I first got into wetland conservation, and dating myself, I worked with Pascal like 16 years ago. We first met on my master's thesis, and that was partly triggered by the Lake Winnipeg eutrophication process and phosphorus loading. And that's carried on in the Great Lake. It continues to be a problem. And so, this is exploring some of that ecosystem service provision. Next slide, please. And then looking at biodiversity, sort of the macrophagia, the climate regulation that's occurring with the water table, and then habitat support. So this is a really fascinating figure here that I would love to hear more about as well as we work together in the team. I think we're sometimes in the lead up to these AGMs, you really connect more with people, and so I'm looking forward even tomorrow to hearing more about some of this work. Thank you. Next slide. And then we shift into the policy, or pardon me, sort of the next objective. And there's again 4 parts here that I just want to flag, and I recognize my time is running low. One is sort of this sense around policy scenarios and costs. And so what we've done in the Lake Winnipeg watershed is a scan of the policies and relevant legislation. And then through sort of engaging with experts around it, we've looked at sort of a relevance ranking for policy. There is work being done by other groups, in particular the Environmental Law Center, about this that I think could really benefit from collaboration on. So I think of that as a future opportunity. But that was in the prairies, that looking at this scan. We're also then incorporating response from the survey that has that, if you recall, that survey component and section, and then integrating those things into sort of a common narrative that I think will help inform what Guillaume was speaking about earlier. And then in the Great Lakes, this is sort of a similar approach, but well, similar but different. So looking at sort of key informant interviews. So really fascinating to see what Roy's team has been doing here and around expansion of agriculture and then questions around change. So, as you can see, we've taken slightly different approaches in some cases, but enough that they complement and enhance each other. Next slide, please. And this I will note too. This is around pardon me, I can't speak, improving the cost of wetland conservation estimates. And this is me trying to bring in two slightly different objectives from two different extension projects and meld them. So if it's slightly awkward, I take responsibility for that. But there's a sense of Pat Lloyd-Smith and Liam Bolt really took the lead from the University of Saskatchewan on looking on a paper that we published just this winter on sort of an economic model around cost estimates. And we'll look at that more in a moment. But then also the Great Lakes is meta-analysis of cost effectiveness that has been going on with the Great Lakes team. So there's really fascinating with those main results, looking at phosphorus and questions about preservation and conservation as well. Next slide, please. And this is where I want to highlight the work that Pat and Liam, or Liam and Pat, we'll go with Liam first, that they did here. And I think this is enhancing some of the work that has been ongoing around precision agricultural data and buffers of wetlands. And you can see from farm drained, intact, and partially drained wetlands, sort of a change in the yield that is occurring. And we're happy to share, and you can see some of the paper in agricultural systems that has just come out on that. So that has informed much of the economic model development that our team on the prairies has been doing and will be collaborating with and reaching across with the Great Lakes. And of course, all of these objectives together to sort of enhance that and elevate it. Next slide, please. This is, if you don't, I mean, we're all sort of scientists here. We all enjoy reading a good paper, but this is some of the summaries that came out from that paper. So I want to encourage you to look more closely at that. If you have time, you can either use this slide after or the paper itself. Nearly done. I have 2 minutes left. Next slide, please. And then this other sort of fascinating subject of leakage analysis, and I know Guillaume has mentioned that, and I've been working on some of this sort of understanding of the movement, the leakage if you have one action in one area to another, what drives conversion or retention. And so we're nearly done this. We have until the end of April, so lots of time to go. But this idea of what is it, how we say link biophysical and policy mapping, and what are the factors that will drive or attract conversion or retention activities. So we have a sort of a metric, a theoretical model that we've put together that I think that will use data from, that is using data from the survey and as well as from the other work that the biophysical work that others are doing, but with sort of this policy lens, like what will drive it where to the other, and factors such as sort of urban conditions or environmental attitudes, policy strength, incentive options are all sort of part of that package that can pull in one level, in one way or the other. So that is will be a future activity for the Great Lakes watershed, and I think I'm hoping and looking forward to the refinement of that in that, but we have it here for the prairies. Next slide, please. And then these last steps, minimizing costs, maximizing benefits, and then this integrated decision-making tool. Those are particularly around the Great Lakes component, but there are parallels with the others. So we will be finalizing that this month and then into the next couple of years with the Great Lakes project. Next slide. Now, this is something I obviously poorly created that chart, didn't I? I tried to make it bigger so everyone could see, but it kind of looks blocky. But the idea of collaboration between objectives, and I think, as I explicitly said earlier, there are inherent challenges, I think, with such a large project, but it has been overall, I think, been done quite well to bring in so many experts and great experience across this team. And, this idea of how do we keep this collaboration rolling? So as I put those arrows in, we have benefited so much but we could have, and will continue to as we progress, using some of those wetland mapping tools and loss rates and where it's at, to use the biophysical information to inform more around the survey and the leakage and the policy. And I think that we have collaborated well, and I think we're going to collaborate better going forward, especially as everyone's got their feet under them. I think now those first few years are sometimes a bit tricky as we all try to get our data in the way we know how at the start. But yeah, there's been good collaboration overall. Next slide, please. And we're looking forward to, I guess, again, sort of 2 points. These are the questions that were raised. Of course, there's going to be, we want to publication of manuscripts, but also that learning and knowledge transfer out to producers and other and beyond. So it's not just manuscripts, but I think some of that sort of forming on that integrated publication approaches around economics and biophysical integration, around policy, but then engages on with all those other from the economics and the biophysical components. And then this use of scenario analysis is quite something I'm keen about. You see if you see a different choice, we don't know what the future is going to look like. We've heard about the uncertainty politically in terms of funding that Guillaume and Irina have mentioned earlier. And, I think it's useful to be able to understand how those changing conditions could impact wetlands. And then another sort of action-oriented thing that we're really excited to do, I know Roy Brower has done a lot of work on transferability and comparative analysis. I think a powerful thing here is that we did a combined survey for 5 provinces of Canada on wetlands. And this allows for comparability that we haven't had before. So we had the funding to do this. And I think that's really amazing. And so we're looking forward to what we can publish and also the key messages arising from that. Next slide. And then, of course, what would we do if we had more resources? Well, everything. But a little bit of, this is from the collaborative input from the team. So ideas of deep learning and AI tools, more engagement on policy and the incentives of policy, and the compliance within is something I'm keen about. Probably, if we had more resources, time to help some of our grad students carry on and publish some of this work. And then exploring more around carbon markets and wetland restoration. As we're thinking about this, in about a couple hours, there's a colleague that's in carbon markets is stopping by our farm to chat about that in a few hours. Like, it's interesting to see how those are out there. So I'm really keen to think more about those markets and those instruments and how they work. And then note that we have been working on an NSERC discovery grant, and this will be a topic of future application. Next slide, and then I'm wrapping up, I promise. Just some of these impacts. I think this has created a more robust and accurate change conversion product that has not existed before. I think it's integrative. There's interdisciplinary viewpoints of this project that Irina's team has brought together in a remarkable way, looking at all the people in this call. And then automated and repeatable. The approach is nearly fully automated. That's particularly with the biophysical. And then, of course, we're looking at, I think what we've seen, not automated, that might be in the wrong slide, but just that there is repeatable and sort of continuous improvement around policies and incentives that we've contributed to that knowledge. So we hope that will be a real contribution from this work. And I believe that's my last slide. Acknowledgements. There you all are. Probably, I really appreciate the chance to talk here today and to present. I know I will have missed from my team, from the socioeconomics team. So I welcome all of you to turn your videos on and help respond to questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, John. That was a really fascinating coverage of the topics from our lens, really complicated topics. Maybe you felt the same when we were presenting. So thank you for stitching that together. I think you and Pascal both had the greatest challenges of bringing together different perspectives. I'm going to look for hands up to see who wants questions, but in the meantime, I'm going to ask a couple of you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One of the things that you talked about was that few farmers had retained or restored wetlands, were motivated to do so by conservation payments. That's exactly what we had found in the reverse auction experiment that we did with Adamzevich and Claire and others. So that didn't surprise me so much, but what did surprise me was that you said that producers are more likely to participate in wetland retention programs than restoration programs, and yet we feel, I think Pascal and I both have had conversations about this, that governments are more interested in restoration than retention programs. So can you kind of like deconstruct that a little bit? Because that to me reveals a real opposing kind of perspective, and I wonder what the implications of that would be for
Yeah.
policies moving forward. That's my first question. I have three, so go for it, John.
Oh, Irina, you just don't have enough questions. That's the problem. Okay, so allow me to sort of suggest something, and Roy, Pat, G, anyone else of my sort of economic colleagues can step in. I think there is a hesitancy, as we often think about incent for governments to get into retention. Right? There's a lot of literature around that. It's sort of perpetual payments for something that someone is doing anyway. And so there's this concern around, in times of scarce budgets and all that sort of element. So I think that's part of that. And then from a government side, and then in terms of producers, I think in some ways restoration is, retention, they kind of want that. It acknowledges some of the work that they're doing. But what they don't want is actually someone coming on their land all the time and checking. And there's a private property rights element in there too that I think is real. We need to interrogate that more. Like I say, it's a preliminary result, and I think Ashley is looking a little bit more into that too. But I think that will be an outcome that we really want to dig into, because as we know, like government of Alberta, they love, the Auditor General came out here with ducks the other day to make sure that we were actually doing what we did on our wetlands. And you can see that on a restored wetland very easily. Maybe a little more nebulous around a retained one. So I would suggest there's something like that.
I hope that the tools that we're talking about developing can be able to give greater ability to monitor, report, and if necessary, verify these things moving forward. But I wonder if it's time for I'm not going to say, I can't believe I just about said it's time for a change of mindset from the government. But I mean, especially because if you think about, Guillaume, a lot of the indigenous communities that are retaining wetlands, but also don't benefit from that. And I think that it's maybe time to revisit that thinking, because we show, the data shows, and maybe Pascal, you can support this emphatically or not, but our data shows that it's best to retain the wetlands on the landscape from a carbon perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, from those other things. And yet there's no policy incentive to do that, is what I'm thinking, and that it's really the restoration. And yet with the restoration data, and I'm thinking again of that beautiful profile that Tim Moore and Christian and Rico showed of how long it takes centuries to kind of recover some of that function. And so maybe this is a way that we can use our data to really at least open up the dialogue to have those conversations about what kind of policy incentives we should have moving forward. Pascal, go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, not only is there benefits in terms of just the ecosystem service impacts, also the cost impact. And so there was a follow-up to the Drever et al. 2021 paper that was looking at nature-based climate solutions that focused on the difference between restoration versus preservation. And that clearly also concludes that keeping intact ecosystems on the landscape, especially things like wetlands and grasslands, makes much more sense, both from a conservation perspective, but also on the cost perspective. So I think that's well understood. I think it's trying to get governments to understand, and I understand why it's challenging, because accounting for leakage, and then when governments invest in programs, they want to see incremental change. And so it's trying to figure out how do you demonstrate the value of retention versus kind of the ongoing background of that, death by 1,000 cuts, ongoing loss, to really value ecosystem retention and preservation on the landscape.
Yeah. And that's a fascinating, I think what you both mentioned too, the changing mindset is hard. But also, as you flag around, like incorporating sort of indigenous values into wetlands, I think we've always acknowledged has been something we could have done better in this project. It's not a criticism. It's just, we're focused on the private land so much, which typically are settler colonial sort of structures. It'd be fascinating, and I would, as I'm talking, that would be a future one. I would love to have more resources to think about. We have a lot of those networks around grasslands, but I think I've struggled around that with wetlands. So.
Well, we have a good proposal that we wrote that wasn't funded, so maybe we can resurrect that somehow. Because I do think that bringing in that Indigenous perspective is important. I don't see any hands up, and maybe your colleagues can turn their cameras on just so that they can be there with you and support as I go to the next question. And
yeah,
this
Roy,
is coming.
Roy, turn that video on, please. Pat, I know you're there.
Yeah, I think that Jude helped me understand this a bit better, and I do admit that my adult daughter had just finished graduate school at the Monk School of Public Policy, and I'm learning more about economics. I always thought that economics was just about money, but what I think Jude taught me was that you use the dollar value to influence decision making, not because you're actually doing a carbon market kind of thing. And so can you just elaborate a little bit about the monetary versus non-monetary benefits that you are exploring in the work, and if and how those benefits can be incorporated into the types of tool that I mentioned under Objective 4?
Jay, there you go.
I think that Patrick and Roy are also very good experts on this topic. So maybe I can start something, and I will let Pat and Roy to complete that. The non-market evaluation actually aims to provide dollar values for the resources, natural resources, environmental goods and services, which is not exchanged in the markets. There are different methods to do that, but the most important part of the story is that actually we focus on the total economic value, which is more focused on the potential improvement of the benefits or the benefits in utilities or well-being that people can have. So it's what we aim to do is to give a very authentic values of the environment, which is not the price that we can find to buy something in the market, because the value and the price are two very different concepts in economics, and the value means the value used in economics is very centered in humans' well-being. So if we buy something, that means the value of these things is for sure bigger than the price of the thing. If not, we will not buy. And there is some gap between the value and the price. That is the consumer surplus. It's something that we can get by doing this exchange. If not, we will not do that. So that's the idea of the value of the environment, the value of the environment. But it has been too much often mistaken as a price, and the nature is not for sale. But I will leave my colleagues to give more thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Roy and Pat. Did you want to add anything to that? And Lota?
I think G already explained it very well. I think the most important reason why a lot of environmental economists are trying to put a monetary value on public environmental goods is because they think money speaks louder than words. So it's very difficult to monetize public environmental goods because there is no market price, and as G said, the price is not the same as the value. And if we want to include them in policy and decision support tools, like cost benefit analysis, then they often, if we don't quantify them in monetary terms, they often become invisible, or they're forgotten, and the money often speaks louder than highlighting that there is something out there that doesn't have a monetary value, but it is important to also retain it or to protect it. And so that's why we're using it. And what you also see increasingly so is that there is legislation that tries to make the polluter pays for the pollution, and there have been some incidents where through litigation companies are asked to pay for the damage, the environmental damage that they caused. And so another important reason for the valuation, that's the second one, is by imposing these values, you incentivize producers or consumers to behave more responsibly, because they are being made aware of what the punitive consequences might be in monetary terms if they do damage public environmental goods.
So it's like coming with a common language that you can understand and make decisions accordingly, although there is no actual transaction of dollars in the case. That is really, really helpful. Thank you for taking the time to explain that. We're past time now, but I do want to put one question out to the socioeconomists on the call. We worked really hard, some of us, in coming up with the slide deck for Objective 4 of a tool that is intended to influence policy and practice. We did not have a socioeconomist as part of that conversation, but I would really ask if you could help give your feedback on to whether this is a good enterprise, and if so, what would make it useful from your lens to policymakers and practitioners, because it is a huge lift, and we want to make sure that it's resources well spent. And if so, would really like to hear your perspectives on that, but not for today. Today, again, I just want everybody to acknowledge John for being nominated for leading this group. Thank you again, John, for the heavy lift. And I've witnessed how many days you worked on it, and I'm very grateful to you and to everybody that contributed. Thank you very much.